Hi, you're listening to Marcia Pally and conversations I'm having with people about the criteria we should use to design and implement our economic and political policies. What should be our basic framework for determining public policy? These conversations are based on ideas from a book of mine, Commonwealth and Covenant, Economics, Politics, and Theologies of Relationality, because we're looking specifically at relationality as this framework for policy. Relationality includes both the individual person and the relations and contexts that he or she is in. Relationality is developed in many of our philosophical traditions and also in several theological traditions. Whether you think theologies are the word of the divine or an illuminating metaphor, in both cases they offer us much about how the world and people work, and so about the policies that will lead to the greatest human flourishing. Please join us in this series of conversations. Commonwealth and Covenant was published by Erdman's Press in 2016. You can follow me at marciapally.com or search for me on Facebook and Twitter.
I wanted to start today, by doing a review of just one concept from our previous discussions, then some highlights from the text that we read for today, the end of Commonwealth and Covenant, Part 1, Chapter 3, and the beginning of Part 2, Chapter 1, actually most of Part 2, Chapter 1. But I wanted to begin with a review of this concept, the idea of early modernity, separability, and the immanent frame, because this will come up later in our discussion today as well. So as we discussed in early modernity, with the increase in scientific knowledge and technological control of the world, great benefits ensued in survival, in longevity, in prosperity, in trade, in medicine. And along with this came a shift in the way people experienced themselves in the world. And this is quite usual for the way cultures operate. A shift in culture, a change in culture, something new, will not yield only positive and only negative outcomes, but usually both. And what the shift in how people started to look at the world involved a shift to a binary way of thinking. Because with the sensation that we can know the laws of nature, we can be on top of nature by testing the laws of nature, by empiricism, by controlling nature, for good reasons, for survival, for trade, for nutrition, for health, for medicine. This makes nature something more of an object outside us that we are controlling. It makes the world something more on the other side of the binary, the mind, the world. This had a very ironic outcome, because the immanent frame, as Charles Taylor calls it, the focus on this world, sounds like it's going to produce a deeper intimacy, a greater connectedness with this world. After all, starting in the 16th and 17th century, people were spending much more time on this world, investigating the laws of the planets, the laws of nature, and so on, because there were tremendously positive outcomes that emerged. So it was worth spending your time and effort and energy on this world. And that sounds like a greater connectedness to this world would follow. But ironically, something of almost the opposite ensued, which was a distancing of the self and the inside of the mind, notice inside of the mind, to the external world as an object that is studied. So ironically, although it might seem that the increase in scientific and technological knowledge and focus on the immanent frame of this world would produce a greater connectedness, it, in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, produced this binary of distance from the world and a model or an imaginary of thinking of mind as inside the head and the world as out there. And if you notice, so a philosopher like René Descartes, one of the great rationalists of the early modern period, he held that we come to true ideas by deducing from true first principles, a process that occurs entirely inside the mind. The second great philosopher of the rationalist tradition, Immanuel Kant, held that we have categories of understanding inside our heads. And we see the world through these categories, thus having no direct access to the world, or in his words, the noumena, out there. Today, in our discussion and in our reading from Commonwealth and Covenant, pages 49 to 58, I want to talk about the ethical difficulties of a kind of model or imaginary whereby you're in your head and others and the world are out there. The ethical difficulties begin with imagining ourselves as separate, and a separated person has no way to know what is going on with somebody else. And in fact, theoretically, has no way of knowing if other people are really out there. Could be a hallucination or a dream. Belief in a kind of mind separatedness makes ethics not only unlikely, but irrelevant. How do you know what's going on out there? Anyway, you have no call to be concerned with others who are, after all, equally unconcerned with you because they have no idea if you're really out there. This problem also has a history in early modernity. And I give it a kind of shorthand called the problem of autonomous doing. Science and increasing control of the environment aimed at well-being, at health, at nutrition. They also allow from the slide from what we can do to benefit human well-being to what we can do, period. Autonomous doing became a good in itself. Let me repeat that. So, of course, all the efforts of the 16th, 17th, 18th century to get control of nature and improve trade, nutrition, health, etc., put an emphasis on do-it-yourself, do-it-ism, do-it, autonomous doing. But with the effort to do whatever you could to benefit humanity comes a prioritizing of doing whatever you can, of autonomous doing itself becomes a value culturally. And I want to talk about Protestantism's inadvertent role. I stress inadvertent, nonetheless. With Protestantism focuses on a mandate for each person to strive towards moral conduct and God. You know, this is a very admirable effort. But with the emphasis on striving individually towards moral conduct and God, comes again a cultural valuing of individual striving per se, which became a way of life, a frequent and praised activity, and a well-exercised muscle, something that's practiced a lot because it's done a lot. Striving is done a lot in modern Western culture. So a well-exercised muscle, and precisely because it was admirable, striving became a well-exercised muscle of practice, not only in the religious effort to strive towards a moral life in God, but everywhere. Striving per se becomes admirable. Advances in living standards and the relief of much misery from striving in the sciences and in the worldly activities, but striving becomes interwoven in ethical behavior, and so remember, striving itself is an admirable activity. Why not? But losses that might emerge from individualist striving become harder to see. If individualist striving becomes culturally an admired activity, any losses, any unproductive outcomes that might emerge from individualist striving become harder to identify in a culture where individualist striving is gaining a valued position. Also in our discussion today were descriptions of what are the downsides, what are the unproductive societal outcomes of excessive situatedness and excessive separability. Now, we in the modern West might have a little bit excessive separability, but for a great deal of humanity and in other places today, excessive situatedness may yield negative outcomes. So let's start with that. To begin with, without the notion of persons as distinct, separate from each other, and of inviolable, distinct dignity, situatedness becomes a cover for suppression and oppression. Within groups, situatedness becomes a pretext to stash political or socioeconomic change, and it becomes a club who want to keep others, like minorities or women, out of the club, who want to repress or suppress. Between groups, situatedness becomes a zero-sum thinking and us-them thinking. We have our tight little clan or group or nation, they have theirs, and it can nudge along us versus them thinking. Sociologist Peter Berger was right to note that a too sharp criticism of separability, quote, should pause and question whether he wishes to include in the denunciation the specifically modern discoveries of human dignity and human rights. Because the notions of human dignity and human rights are specifically those that attach to you regardless of your situation, regardless of your relations. So we should be very careful to notice that there are downsides to excessive situatedness. Keith Thomas has explained this in the history of 18th century European and American villages as the tyranny of local opinion and the lack of tolerance displayed toward nonconformity. Social Darwinists, I'm skipping through history, social Darwinists pick this up, and they argue against Darwin himself. They argued for the superiority of one race, their own, of course. And they created an in-group of their own race and argued that this was biologically determined. This is situatedness not in a cultural ethnic group, but in biological morphological distinction. I'm going to move on now to some of the downsides of separability. To sum up situatedness, the downsides of too much situatedness are top-down oppression and crowd conformity and prejudice, in-group versus out-group thinking. to separability, an overload of separability yields the separated person acting from self-interest without concern for the outcomes for anyone else or for the common good. Or it leads to the separated person not acting at all from apathy or alienation. Or it leads to a cycle of too much separability, which leads to too much situatedness, because an emphasis on self can lead to a loss of societal cohesion and a loss of the sense that we should act for the common good and for the long term of our common fate together. With this loss of acting for the common good or concern for the commons in our actions, we see arrive in cheating, thievery, grabbing, violence. After all, why not? You're out for yourself without concern for the commons. And when you have the societal chaos that results from cheating, thievery, grabbery, and violence, you end up with calls for a strong man to stanch the violence and restore order. And the strong man enforces high situatedness. And that's how you can get a cycle of undue or excessive separability leading to excessive situatedness. Yeah. I'd like to talk about excessive separability in a few categories. I'm going to start with the law. Legal protections can be seen as a backup, a structure, when more usual means of resolving conflict fail. For example, when negotiation, when all of the micro conversations and micro moves and discussions that resolve conflict in the normal flow of daily life fail, you have a legal system that backs you up to try to adjudicate a just outcome. However, legal systems can also come to be seen as a first resort, not a last resort, when other societal and communicative means fail, but as a first resort. It can be seen as where life naturally, normally occurs. And you get an increasingly litigious society, people suing each other right and left and taking each other to court. And you see increasing incarceration rates. And you see the notion of lawyering not as negotiating just outcomes between people, but as a kind of legal Wild West where lawyers aim at achieving their client's end or often their own ends, just skirting inside the law. Good lawyering, it can be said, is situated in the organic whole of society and is responsible for promoting the public good, diffusing sound principles among people, and for promoting justice, counseling the ignorant, defending the weak and oppressed. This does not make lawyers unconcerned about their clients, but suggests that their private interests of their clients are in fact situated in society and responsible to society. Legal scholars such as Russell Pierce, Eli Wald, and others have been doing work recently on the self-understanding of law and lawyers. Do they see themselves as responsible to their clients situated in the common good, or do they see themselves as this kind of, a term they use, kind of hired gun, another metaphor from the Wild West, a hired gun to accomplish as much as possible for the benefit of one party without regard to societal impact. So the notion of undue separability would affect the way we think of our law and legal system. What about excessive separability and the question of abandonment or a feeling of alienation or anomie? Suspicion of relation or a breakdown of relations in society, a focus on the self, may not leave one free and flourishing as a successful entrepreneur. It might leave one alone, disconnected from goals larger than one's own private lifestyle. With individual choice valorized, we are free to choose, but we may have few choices that are important to us, that organize and give meaning to what we do. Focus on the self and what you can do for you yourself valorizes the act of choosing per se. But what about what you're choosing? What about the options from which you're choosing? And you can get a situation where you have the freedom to choose, but either the options to choose well are not available to you, or the internal mechanisms to know how to distinguish good from bad choices is not available to you. One can become not unsatisfied, but unsatisfiable. In a way, that is a short definition of alienation and anomie. You can choose, but nothing really satisfies you because you're not in any kind of value structure or priority structure where something counts as more valuable as something else and therefore worth doing. So you can become not unsatisfied, but unsatisfiable. J.K.A. Smith writes, the modern buffered self is all sealed off from significance, left to ruminate in a stew of its own ennui. Now, even assuming that the separated person all by herself could develop a purpose, a life purpose on her own, such a person would lack the networks, public policies, or the institutions to realize any goal. One would be left with little opportunity to pursue opportunity, and little help when things didn't go well. To realize goals, one needs support at several levels, from family to community to the larger entities of government and nation. I'm going to move on to separability and self-absorption. And I think this was our earliest concept. If you are separate from the world, if you inherently have nothing to do or very little to do with anything else, and you have very little concern for anyone else or your societal and natural context, then you're out for yourself and for your own benefit, and you likely assume that others are as well. So you better get as much as you can before the other guy takes what you want. And that's a kind of dog-eat-dog picture of the world. And as we said, was Thomas Hobbes's description of the war of all against all. His solution was the strong man that we discussed a moment ago, the Leviathan. And I'm going to read some analyses of what some people have felt is just this sort of devolution into self-absorption. And I'm going to start with David Frum, who was a Republican and a conservative and speechwriter for George W. Bush. And in 2011, he lambasted his own Republican Party for failing what he called its first mandate to provide for the common good and for succumbing to greed. I want to caution that the purpose of the 3 or 4 quotes that I'm going to read here has nothing to do with party politics because everyone involved is of the same party. I'm using the American Republican Party merely as an example, and everybody involved are Republicans, so this is not a political party fight. But notice what David Frum said to his own party. In the aughts, that means 2000 to 2010, in the face of evidence of dwindling upward mobility and long stagnating middle-class wages, my party's economic ideas sometimes seem to have shrunk to just one: more tax cuts for the very highest earners. That year, 2011, Mike Lofgren, a 28-year Republican congressional staffer, wrote, "The Republican Party cares solely and exclusively about its rich contributors." Commenting on the private sector, Greg Smith, who worked for 12 years at Goldman Sachs and then quit, wrote, he described the corporate culture at his former employer, Goldman Sachs, as toxic and destructive, concerned only with making money off of clients, not even making money for your clients, but making money off of your clients, who, he said, are contemptuously called Muppets. Addressing both governance and economics, Mike Stafford and D.R. Tucker, both Republican officers and political commentators, bemoaned the Republican Party's policy as the, quote, tireless defense of struggling millionaires. Slightly ironic. They were quoting John Gehring. When he came to work for Goldman Sachs, it wasn't as severe and exaggerated conditions. And he describes in his article and then in his book that there was much greater sense of teamwork, much greater sense of nurturing junior employees, right, junior people on the job, and an ethic of making money for your client, not making money off of your client. And what he described is a shift over the 12 years that he was there to a much more dog-eat-dog environment. But you're quite right. A lack of concern for the long-term outcome. If you sell a bad car, right, and there are car crashes on the road, you get, first of all, tremendous harm to other people, and there are also economic outcomes. Those people can't work. You get a rise in medical costs. Those rise in medical costs will come back to you in health insurance premiums. Right? So there are ethics and there are also economic consequences of an entire system in which the mutual or reciprocal impact that we have on each other is ignored. And that's precisely the point. This is really the purpose of our conversations, and the purpose of Commonwealth and Covenant is to use certain relational principles as a way to look at our economic and political policies. And if you identify cheating or corruption in other industries, or if you identify it as widespread, then you are locating the problem. Yeah?
Yeah, in this sense, it's a good example, Goldman Sachs. And this is a point I wanted to make, that it's there's a widespread in our economic system. It's not just in banking, but so forth.
Yes. So that's, in some sense, that's the bad news. If it were only Goldman Sachs, right, we would just have a problem in one company. If it's widespread throughout the economy, then we have a deeper problem. And we see the outcomes of this deeper problem in the widening of the wealth and income gaps all over the developed world, and the shrinking of the middle class. So the rich are getting richer and the poor, and the middle class is, because of wage stagnation, rising costs, the middle class is being vitiated. So there's a lot of economic support for what happens when it's not only when greed runs amok. What happens when people have greed as the new normal? Yeah? Instead of a more relational way of understanding yourself and what you do. Yeah? Yeah.
Maybe isn't there another point that the personal responsibility of company owners is just is not that largely verbreitet as it was years ago. So the middle shift is shrinking, and the people that are personally responsible for their own company are not in the position to develop long-term perspectives. So we have these mega concerns with a lot of people, but they are not personally responsible for the deeds they do. They are just representing the company.
I agree to the description too, but it's still a description. And you know, I think we can't reduce responsibility to personal responsibility. I think a company has, and every company does have something like corporate identity, corporate responsibility, and all that stuff. That's nice. Greenwashing, we know it. But I think it's not enough, or it doesn't really help to say, if you've got a family company and the nice older male leader is responsible, and he's, you know, like a father for everybody. It doesn't work. It's not enough. I think we've got to develop principles, society principles, that a company is responsible for. What is the consequence of their doing?
Yes, I agree, but what's the way? How can we do it? And we have to look back, where are the points that...
Yeah, sure. The description is true. Yeah.
Responsibility in one way.
But it wouldn't be enough to say, you know, your personal
is
descriptive.
At this point, I want to make the observation that societies and cultures have certain ways of looking at the world. They have worldviews. They have value systems. And you know, from culture to culture, from era to era, they're not the same. They change. So the value systems, the worldview, the way you expect things to go, what you think the setup is naturally, I'm putting naturally in quotes because it's not natural, it's cultural. The way your expectations are, right, change over time. And one of the things that we've been discussing is a shift in modernity to more separability. Now, I'm not saying that it's the only time in human history that we've had a shift to more separability. I'm also not saying that excessive situatedness would not be equally unproductive. Not at all. But we are noticing, and that's why I began today by talking about the immanent frame and the irony that a focus on empiricism and science and technology, instead of bringing us closer to the world, for a good chunk of early modernity, created this subject-object binary. We've seen a cultural shift. That's nothing new. Cultures are always shifting. It's a question of in which direction. Can we describe the shift? Can we locate its productive and unproductive outcomes? And things like how business is conducted, how companies are set up, how trade occurs, how law occurs, what kinds of laws you have, who's valued, who's not, what's valued, what's not, who is protected, who is not. Yeah? In economy, in law, these things come from the culture's basic understanding of the world, the worldview, the ontology, the value system, the priorities, the assumptions, even that you're not consciously aware of. So, what are we suffering from? We're not suffering from a few women and men not being able to write economics books. We have very good economics books, but they are insufficiently implemented because you could say at first there's no political will, but political will is a secondary level. There's in some sense, there isn't a worldview will. There isn't there isn't a worldview wherein taking account of our reciprocal impact and our relationality is incorporated into our economic policies. So it's not that we lack the economic formula or detail, we lack the worldview. And that's what we're discussing. We're discussing what principles of relational theology might help us with our worldview.